The evidence of the eyewitness testimony within the Gospels is overwhelming. There is no doubt that the modern church in America has failed its people by not teaching them the earliest stages of church history. Apostolic succession paved the way to preserve the New Testament text.
Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce, joined by a special guest today who I'll be bringing on in a minute. This has been an anticipated episode because I've received countless messages on social media and emails through our Facts email about when we were going to respond to this article that released, especially many of the Anglican followers, because everybody was a little bit taken back that this news was released in an article and none of our bishops are actually answering the issue at hand. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is going to be very simple. And I'm going to give it to you. And then I'm going to bring in my guest. The reason is this information was not supposed to be leaked. We learned that as of very recent, that this was actually held in confidence because there's additional meetings that are coming up. And this was not supposed to be put in the public square. So the fact that this blog is even still up and you can read it, which you'll find in the link below, is a little bit surprising, but it's already out. Cat's out of the bag. So what more can you say? But I'm going to bring in a special guest from the Catholic Brothers. I've got Stephen with me here. He's Stephen with a V. I'm Stephen with a PH. And it's good to have you. We enjoy your program. We link a lot of our stuff to you and your brother's work there. Kind of say hey to everybody. A little bit about the stuff you enjoy doing, your journey to becoming Roman Catholic, because you had a journey there. I think it was a circular journey, if I'm not mistaken. But kind of tell everybody who you are, a little bit about your channel, and I'll have a link there for that as well.
Yeah, of course. Stephen, thanks for having me on. Great podcast on the Anglican side of things. So thanks for the work that you're doing. I know a lot of Anglican clergy who really enjoy, actually, we have a lot of cross-fertilization. I have a lot of people that listen to your podcast and also listen to ours. So for those of you who are not familiar, I am one of two. So my brother, Daniel, does a podcast with me called the Catholic Brothers. And so we actually grew up Catholic, very, in a very devout home. We actually do have on our page, you can watch our whole journey. We're on the Cordial Catholic. And so if you want to get like really deep into it, it's in there. But yeah, we became evangelical Protestant for a hot minute, and then slowly kind of climbed the ladder, from, Reformed tradition to Lutheranism, and then eventually made our longest stopover in Anglicanism, and thought I was going to be there likely for the rest of my life. There was always like a little bit in the back of my head thinking like, that there's a possibility that I might not, but for the most part, I was really committed. I was in the ACNA originally, and then eventually transferred to the REC. And so, I was actually a postulant for orders it was about a year and a half or so, if I remember correctly, under Bishop Sutton. Really mostly studying under my local, pastor. But it was over the ultimate oversight of Bishop Sutton. So I had, quite a few like phone calls with him during that time, and met him in person at one of the conferences and things like that. But over time, just with some of the goings on in Anglicanism and also just my own, prayer and continued research and thought and reflection and, wrestling with the issues, found myself, leaving Anglicanism, but not really sure where I was going. It was either Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism. And my wife grew up Orthodox. She's 100% Greek.
Okay.
And I grew up Roman Catholic. So we had a little bit of a discernment phase there. But in the end, both of us came into communion with the Roman Church. And so that's where I've been ever since. So.
You know how in families that have house divided college football in the front of their vehicles where you got to like a line down the middle. And down here at South Carolina and Clemson, did you have East and West, Catholic and Orthodox on the front of your bumpers driving down the road?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Just like any other, mixed Orthodox Catholic family,
You don't see that every day. And we saw who won out, but
right.
And transparency, there's things about Anglicanism, that really have elements of orthodoxy in them, but also very much the Western. And I like some things about the East and some things about the West, but I've told people all the time, like, well, what if we put a gun to your head and said, which one would you be? It's like, wow, okay, that's a little extreme, but sure. But if I had to, I would go to Rome before I would go to Eastern Orthodoxy. I like my Orthodox friends, and sorry for those in the comments that are Orthodox, because I know I have Orthodox that follow this, but y'all are a little cliquish over there. So we love you, but man, calm down a little bit.
Yeah.
Somebody said, thanks for having Brad Pitt on. I didn't realize I had Brad Pitt on today, but apparently
I was going to reveal that later. I wasn't going to make that in the beginning of the show. I mean,
yeah. somebody exposed you in the comments. So.
Unbelievable. Yeah, I'm in retirement, obviously.
Wow, you're doing pretty good. I didn't know Brad Pitt was Catholic. All right. Well, you mentioned Bishop Sutton. I think that's a good turn into the discussion we want to have here, because the rumor mill has now started. And again, as I said at the beginning, I was shocked that none of the bishops were responding to any of the discussions that's going on.
It did go quiet. Yeah. Then
it turns out that's because these discussions weren't supposed to be going on. Somebody broke confidence. An article was written through soulandliberty.com. I'm not going to call names. You can read it for yourself and call the guy out, but this was not supposed to be written. But again, the cat is out of the bag and it has to be dealt with, because these things were going on for an entire year where priests in the diocese had no idea this was going on. Catholics had no idea this was going on. And the statement is that there was a historical step taken, that the Vatican is working toward full communion. Now, I guess part of that isn't shocking, because Pope Francis has been adamant about trying to find commonality kind of with anybody to a fault. Just prior to this releasing, just a few months before that, he met with Archbishop Welby and many of the delegates from Canterbury and to England, and all their priests and bishops, including female bishops. And so that was happening. He's already met with Hindus, and it's a little bit obsessive. So it's not a shock that the Vatican seems to have initiated some sort of dialogue that says, hey, how can we mend some fences, which isn't a bad thing in of itself. But what are your thoughts just on that idea alone, that the Vatican was working toward this?
Yeah. Well, I think that the creation of the Ordinariate ruffled a lot of feathers under Pope Benedict, especially at the time. I remember Rowan Williams he expressed some, in his ever so gentle English way, some bitter disappointment. But I think, I think what Pope Francis is perhaps trying to do, I don't want to, think for him, but one theme of his papacy has been to soften some of the moves of the previous two pontificates. So any quote unquote damage that may have been done under his, perception he may want to revisit those areas. So for instance, this is why, like the Latin Mass stuff that you see, some of the moral theology of Pope John Paul II, questioning whether or not some of that is definitive or not, and opening up the doors for debate. But then also, yes, in this area, where I think perhaps I would say that Anglican Catholic dialogue got stronger under Pope Benedict, but I think there was a perception with some parts of Anglicanism that the dialogue had gone cold, which is why you see this kind of rapprochement with him and with Welby. But of course, a lot of Anglicans, probably 70% of Anglicans, would not be happy about reviving that aspect of it. But I think this goes back to a long process, starting in the 1960s. I think it's like 1966 or something.
It is. Yep.
And I think it was smart for Pope Francis to relocate the dialogue so that it's not with the I forgot what like the the office is called that it was with before. It's like something with ecumenical relations, right? And instead he relocates it with the DDF. I actually like that because that means we've moved beyond niceties and hugging each other, and we've moved into like let's talk about doctrine.
Yes.
Right. And so we've gotten beyond like the false ecumenism era, where we're all just going to have warm feelings. And by the way, there was a place for that. I mean, let's recognize that after the 1960s, like we just came out of a world war where Europe literally destroyed itself. Like Europe was the Middle East, right? It was just like a total wasteland because of war. So there was a place for that kind of like, let's be nice to each other for once. But now I think it's a sign, at least a hopeful sign, that we're moving beyond that and moving towards, okay, now that we like each other, where do we actually disagree? And let's like revisit the actual issues now that we have this new posture instead of just like castigating one another. Now we can actually have this dialogue about substance.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note because the niceties that went on was what happened when Welby showed up. It was just, greetings, blessings, etc. It was very, but this seems to have been much deeper because it wasn't a single visit. There were multiple discussions that were going on between delegates on both sides. And the key here is that this full communion possibility is with Orthodox Anglicans, which does make up the majority, almost 3/4 of the majority of the Anglican communion itself. Even Bishop Welby is not in that number. Archbishop Welby is not Orthodox. Most Anglicans don't like him. And I remember when they posted on social media, even on the Anglican communion page, oh, we've got, all of our delegates are over there in Rome. They're meeting with Pope Francis, and then they're talking about, and it mentioned all of these very things that we're talking about. And I'm sitting here on the other end going, wrong Anglicans. You're meeting with the wrong Anglicans. Those are Fanglicans or fake Anglicans, as my wife calls them. And so, but it turns out those were just pleasantries.
Yeah,
these are real discussions. And I thought that was very interesting that you just brought up that this was taken to a different level. And it is to revisit what they're wanting to call Malta 2, which is building off of Malta 1. And to those that are not familiar with that, let me just kind of give a breakdown of the Malta 1 that happened. This was with Archbishop Ramsey and Pope Paul VI in 1966, as you mentioned. It proposes the differences in manners like the Petrine primacy, infallibility, Mariology would be overcome by ensuring that neither communion is tied to a positive acceptance of all the beliefs and devoted practices of other. Unity and mutual acceptance of holy orders would be based on the recognition of things like ecumenical creeds, common tradition of the ancient church, which there is a ton of common tradition between Anglicanism and the West, because they were in communion together for many, many, many years, all the way back to Augustine of Canterbury, which is in 597 of 601. So there was always that brother kind of. England was always kind of, as one priest says, the redheaded stepchild of Rome. They were always there to kind of push them back and not always compliant, but they were always related. And so
I would actually say it was more special than that. I wouldn't go with the redheaded stepchild. I would actually say that, I mean, England was considered Mary's dowry. That's what Rome always referred to England as. So it was actually a very, very warm relationship, because when France or Spain or Germany would cause problems, England actually very very persistently would come to the defense of orthodoxy. Hence you even have like Henry VIII, right? Like the defender of the faith. That wasn't even just like pleasantries. It was like, well, yes, because England is always conservative. Like on all these issues, England was always known to be very conservative and to move very slowly. So I actually think that the relationship between Rome and England was a lot warmer than that, and really is more of this mother-daughter relationship rather than the adopted redhead stepchild. So I'll give England more credit than that.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think it's a fair assessment too. There were pushbacks. King Alfred and others
Sure.
pushed back that they didn't want the Latin Mass. They wanted to do Mass in English. I mean, and understandably so. I don't think that Alfred was ever against Latin Mass. His just for in his country, it was like this isn't beneficial for us. We'd rather have it in English. And so there was some, pushback there. But at the end of the day, they did fight orthodoxy together. They fought for orthodoxy together. When schism and things that went down, heresies were coming in. I mean, even very, very early on, we find times where heretics arise and they had to do something about it. And Rome worked together with North Africa and in the churches, the Celtic churches and others like that. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to see this. So overall, would you agree that the opportunity and the ability to have these discussions, to have a full communion with the Orthodox, I'm going to clarify, the Orthodox Anglicans is a good thing? It's a good thing historically, and it's a good thing presently. What's your at least take on that?
Yes, I do think, well, so I'm going to think of this from the Roman Catholic side of things. From my perspective, I think it's actually the duty of the papacy to do such things, because it is supposed to be not only the seat of primacy, but the seat of unity. So not only is the primacy of the church centered there, but also her unity is expressed in its fullest sense. So a proper mother is going to seek out her daughters, no matter how far or, far estranged or like not so far estranged, right? Like the goal is to bring everybody into the fold, whether it's unbeliever, believer, separated brethren, or even just a sloppy Catholic, who is technically in the community of the church, but is probably not living up to their vocation. So I would say it's always a good thing. Going back all the way to even like the Council of Florence, right? Like the papacy's job in the church is to foster the unity of Christians and the unity in the faith. So anytime that the papacy becomes a seat of disunity, a seat of schism, is always a great scandal in the church, because it's not the purpose for which it was intended. So I absolutely think it is good. What I would say though, second thing is, number one, if the papacy was going to pick somebody to talk to in Anglicanism to actually make progress, I think they could do no better than Bishop Sutton, personally. So finally, you have an ecumenical dialogue partner who not only knows Anglicanism and is committed to it, right, but is also committed to unity, community unity with the Orthodox and unity with Rome, regardless of how different we each would view where that unity ought to go. But I would say this. Sutton's great challenge in that dialogue is to to not only work with the Roman Catholics in what we believe, right? Because there's a lot there, a lot of hurdles there. But I would also say that when the devil's in the language, right? Like Orthodox Anglicans, what do we mean by that? And I think that is on Sutton to help define, but also, he can define it, but does everyone else in Anglicanism agree with it? Does even the 70% that are in communion with him agree with that? Now, I think that Sutton's Anglicanism can be summed up as sort of a Reformed Catholicism. Really is. He's very much committed to.
That's fair. That's fair.
He's very much committed to the Caroline Divines, to the best of the Oxford movement and the Tractarian movement.
Yes.
But not really where the Tractarian movement went after Newman's defection to Rome. So I think what needs to happen is that Anglicanism needs to define what Orthodox Anglicanism is through Sutton, through these dialogue partners. It has to be defined. And then the dioceses that are going to agree with that need to sign on to something like hard to say, this is what Orthodox Anglicans believe. And everyone who does not believe this is not an Orthodox Anglican, and that's going to be very, very difficult, especially since in recent decades, you have the influx of this very low church evangelical element into Anglicanism. But you also have the ultra more like Anglo-papalist rather than Anglo-Catholic element in Anglicanism. So it's kind of difficult when it's like you got those two extremes under one umbrella. how is Rome supposed to approach this and know that we have a partner that we can actually sign some documents with,
Yeah, that is going to be key here, because as splintered as the Anglican communion from Rome, it is also splintered in its own midst. We just mentioned Mother Church itself. We don't adhere to the leadership anymore of the Archbishop of Canterbury until he repents. So you already have that. Then, like you made mention of, when you look at Sutton, for example, he's in the REC. The REC is very different. They have a different position on like ordinance. For example, they don't ordain women to the priesthood.
Right.
There are dioceses that do that in the ACNA. And because the ACNA, and to those listening, the ACNA is a province made up of multiple dioceses that are independent. That's why the REC has its own bishops.
Right.
They're the Archbishop of the ACNA, but they have their own bishops, just like our diocese has their own, etc. And because of that very take, they make their own decisions on these things. And so if this communion happens, what Stephen was talking about is Rome can come into communion with not the ACNA, because that's too broad.
Yeah.
They can come to communion with dioceses within the ACNA that adhere to whatever agreements they have. Women's ordination is not even going to be debated between the communion of Rome and Anglicanism. That's going to be on the list. Dioceses that have women priests would not be able to be in this communion immediately. That's a non-negotiable for the Roman Catholic Church. And quite frankly, it should be. Now, as it relates to some of these other finer points, that's where this is going to get interesting, because most Anglicans, if they're honest, and they should be, especially the higher church Anglicans, we don't have a problem with a papal authority or the Bishop of Rome, whatever term has been used on in the past. We don't have an issue with the idea of being a leader coming from the Petrine See. We've recognized that for years. I mean, even when King Henry VIII split with Rome himself, creating his own positions, he was still writing back and forth to the Pope. He was still actually arguing against Luther in favor of Rome's positions.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're that ridiculously that far apart. Some of our fights, they're repairable. And we're 400 plus years past all that. I mean, or 500 plus years past that. I mean, we can work together almost in dealing with some of this stuff, but you're right. The definition of what is an Orthodox Anglican is going to have to be put into nice, bold black letters, and there's going to have to be legible signatures on it. And I don't see an issue with those that have been meeting. Archbishop Foley Beach did a wonderful job in his tenure, in his 10 years as the Archbishop. He has done the best he can to seek reconciliation with everybody, including Bishop Welby. So we do see that the group they brought up there, Monet, Sutton, Foley Beach, these are the unifiers that are going to work hard to make this happen. And they clearly have been. And there's apparently another meeting. But I think that's a key and fair point. The burden is actually on the Anglican Church here to come up with the definition of an Orthodox Anglican, because we actually don't see what that, because there's plenty that say I am, but then when you put out the things on the table that lead to debate, we don't see eye to eye on all of those definitions. I think that's a fair point. Now, in this blog here, what was brought up is that there was historic events that kind of created some hostility at the end of the 19th century, specifically when Pope Leo XIII declared all Anglican ordinations absolutely null and utterly void, which I as an Anglican, I take issue with. But, I look at men in the past, specifically with the believers in the British Isles, like, I don't see how, like you said, the role of the papacy is to try to even unite, bring into communion, do what it can to help, even if there's wayward people, because there always will be. I don't.
There always
know,
will be, or will be. What'd you say?
Not will be. Will ILL will be. We don't want will be much longer, but
right.
But if you, I mean, you look at Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, and what was his goal for the British Isles? He saw churches, apostolic churches spread out. He saw John's churches. He saw a combination of some of Paul's churches and Peter's churches. What was his goal? To unite them, to bring unity in the apostolic churches. He was a uniter. And I don't know how you feel about Pope Leo the 13th's declaration there. Like, do you think that helped anything, or do you think it made matters worse with the hostility?
Well, and I mean, in all charity, I'll say what I think about that. I think that, I think his arguments for it, they don't read well in the modern situation of the church.
Okay.
So some of the arguments he makes for that conclusion, I think are able to be cogently argued against from an Anglican, right? They can look at it and be like, well, come on. And in fact, they did. It wasn't it Scipius Officio was the response, right? And I actually thought that the Bishop of London and I think it was London and Canterbury that wrote that. I have to look again. It's been a while. But their response was really strong to the Bishop of Rome, actually. However, in Roman Catholic theology, as I understand it, is that it's not always the rationale for a conclusion that is infallible, right? But the conclusion itself stands. And so I don't think, when I was saying that the Roman pontiff's charism is to unify the church, it's also to bring clarity where there's confusion. And there was a lot of confusion at the time because there was a Catholicizing tendency that had cropped up in the Church of England, where externally the churches were looking more and more like Catholic churches. And so you had this confusion among even the Orthodox, right? We're like, well, what is this? You know, like encountering it and having these dialogues and all this. And so, and you even had, Catholics who were wondering, well, can I intercommune here? Like, can we take communion at these churches? Are these Catholic churches? Are they, so I think in times like that, it is incumbent upon the Bishop of Rome to provide clarity for the faithful so that they know what are balls and strikes. Okay. In this case, I think that the Bishop of Rome was correct. I do believe that about Anglican orders as they were at that time. However, there has been a lot of cross-pollination since with Anglicans and other communions that have valid but illicit orders. So you'll have like the Polish National Catholic Church, and they have participated in some of the ordinations in Anglicanism. So what's weird now is that in Anglicanism, you have, from a Catholic perspective, you have all sorts of invalid orders commingling with valid ones. Illicit, but still valid, right? So not legally authorized to offer the sacrifice of the Eucharist. However, when it is offered, it is valid, right? So let's say it's a Polish National Catholic. I think the Polish National Catholic Church is still considered valid, but illicit. I don't know if they ever did they end up ordaining women to the priesthood? I don't think so. Okay. Let's just say they didn't for the sake of the argument, because they're not the only group that Anglicans have sort of like come into intercommunion agreements with and stuff, and shared clergy and things like that.
Yeah, you got Old Catholic. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. And isn't that Calvin? I think Calvin was.
Yeah, Calvin Robinson's Old Catholic now.
There you go.
That's correct.
So that actually brings up a whole new situation where I think, let's just say on the hypothetical, we get past the doctrinal issues and we actually do have this signed thing, right? One of the easy ways to deal with the ordination issue is just to bring up the conditional. So just like if you don't know if someone is baptized, even the Orthodox have this conditional baptism. So it's basically, if not already baptized, the servant of God X is baptized in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. So same thing in Rome. There's conditional dispensation of the sacraments. So I think that might be a way forward. I don't know if that would even be acceptable to a lot of Anglican clergy who would be horribly offended by the idea of having to be conditionally reordained. But it's better. I think that would be a heck of a lot better than being reordained just, on its face. Just because how would you be able to do a full investigation of every single person's line of succession in Anglicanism? Because even like record keeping isn't as tight there, especially after some of the schisms that have happened and stuff. So there's a sense in which I think I can envision a way forward, just me, some idiot, who's sitting here as a layman telling you what I think, but you know what I'm saying? But I think
Sure.
there is stuff that can be done about that if there was actual tangible progress on this front of what is Orthodox Anglicanism, and then on the issues that divide us, where is it even possible to find a way to have a signed agreement?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the succession side of it, there's two arguments in the Anglican camp. There's this camp over here that says we have our orders because we were already an apostolic church in succession before Canterbury was established in Kent by Augustine, which is true. Even Pope Gregory recognized already apostolic churches there. So they didn't need Rome for validation. They needed Rome to help unify that validation. So that's one argument. The other side of the argument is we feel like we can't operate without Rome. So this needs to happen so fast. I'm somewhere in the middle. So
Okay.
I don't think that because some like, well, who cares? We don't need Rome. It's like, okay, well, then stop using the creed every single Sunday when you say one holy Catholic and apostolic church, because you're part of the problem, not the solution. Part of the goal here is to bring unity to the Church of the See of Peter. Why wouldn't you, my friends, why wouldn't you want to see unity with the See of Peter? We were in it for over 1,500 years almost. I mean, like, why not want to see that come back? That's my acknowledgement over here. The other acknowledgement on the other half, that's to the other extreme there, is particularly that you'll do anything that's uncalculated almost to make see this thing happen like tomorrow. But like you stated, there has to be clear understanding from each other's. What would Rome be willing to live with or live without that Anglicans are they're going to be who they are. They're not going to accept certain things. Some will. I mean, there's plenty of Anglo-Catholics that have a high Mariology that other Anglicans don't. We all view her with greater than most Protestant views.
Yeah.
We see her as looking at whether you're talking about the Theotokos, we accept that. Whether you're talking about major aspects of her honor, most Anglicans are on board with that. So the issue then becomes: do we have to accept other things? Do we have to accept the Immaculate Conception? Although, does every Anglican have to accept it? Do we have to accept the bodily assumption of Mary? These are the things in Mariology, because even in the article, it just says Mariology. Well, what aspect? I mean. Yeah. Clearly we accept the virgin birth. Clearly we accept elements that she is the beloved amongst and given grace that's beyond anything anybody else has had. So, I mean, there's elements where even some Catholics have no problem, or Anglo-Catholics, excuse me, venerating her. So the question then becomes, Mariology is too broad. What would Rome accept from a faith position from Anglicans who say have a high view of Mary, but aren't willing to go as far as maybe the bodily assumption or something like that? See, these are questions that I don't think have been fully ironed out yet. I don't know your thoughts.
Well, I don't think it would be possible. I don't think it would be possible for Rome to permit dissent from the Immaculate Conception or the bodily assumption of Mary, because those are both dogma. So that's like that's as high as you get. Like, like those are dogma. So I would say if Anglicans couldn't get over just those two, I don't see how intercommunion could actually happen. Yeah. But here's another thing to think about. So I know that I said with Pope Leo, his argument doesn't quite hold, and the argument that I'm talking, because he has many arguments in that document.
Sure.
The argument that doesn't quite hold is like the changing of the liturgy, right? Because we changed the liturgy, like, you know, in the mid 20th century. So those are the arguments that don't really hold. I think the argument that does hold, and it's something that I think Anglicans should take back as a challenge and work on, is this. There's many different versions of the telling of Anglican history amongst Anglicans. And for instance, on your end of things, you like to start with the pre-Augustinian mission, right? And tie Anglicanism all the way back to that, and say there's this continuity. I think what Leo did well was to show that there's a sharp discontinuity with the English Reformation, and not only the church that came before that under Rome, but even the pre-Augustinian mission church. Like, did Cranmer actually restore a sort of pre-Augustinian Celtic Christ? Like, no. Like, it was very clearly he was completely absorbed in the continental things that were going on. Like, even like the Book of Common Prayer, was basically blueprinted off of what's that guy's name? Herman von Weed, I think his name is. But he had a prayer book that he made. I think he was from Nuremberg, but it was called a simple and religious consultation. You can look that up. It's like the 1540s. He wrote it. But what he did was he actually, for the first time, tried to create a pan-Protestant prayer book for Germans, for Lutherans, for Calvinists, for even the ultra like Zwinglians. And the thought was that over time, as Protestants are praying the same things, that they would kind of converge, right, and come to this kind of more greater unity of the faith. Well, it fell apart, right? But that book was actually translated into English. It was one of the only ones that was, because there was a lot of them floating around. But this one was translated into English, and Cranmer gets his hands on it. And I'll tell you right now, you go read that, dude, and that is the template for the Book of Common Prayer. Like, especially the Holy Communion service. So you look at that and you're like, okay, well, that is 100% Continental Reformation, right? So the Book of Common Prayer, especially in its 1552 iteration, is 100% like Martin Bucer. Like, it's totally his theology. 1559, like, reinserts a few Catholic things back in, but for the most part, it's a Protestant prayer book. And then by the time you get to the Restoration of the monarchy, with the 1660 and then the 1662 prayer book, now that England had committed regicide, it was sort of like a big gut check for them. And they were like, well, look, we're not that, right? Like, we're not radical Protestants, right? So there is this era of kind of ebb and flow between radical Protestantism on the one hand and a Catholicizing tendency. But I think it really reaches its peak with the Caroline Divines and then especially with the Tractarian movement. So I think it's on Anglicans to say what happened from the time of Cranmer to the time of the Caroline Divines. We have to like say, that's not us, right? Like, that's not us. We are actually a Catholic church. Of the brand of like the Jeremy Taylors of the world and these Caroline theologians, and especially culminating in the Tractarian movement, and we receive the theology of the Tractarians. Now, again, we need to differentiate between the Anglo-Catholicism that comes out of the Tractarian movement and the Tractarians themselves. Two different things, right? Because with there's almost like a Victorian romanticism that emerges after the Tractarian movement, where it's like all about just the smells and bells and there's no substance really. But the Tractarians were all about the substance, and there wasn't as much of the smells and bells. So it was very much focused on like, no, we are recovering the patristic faith. Like, this is actually what put Rome on its heels originally. If you look back at it, like, Rome was getting sweaty because the Anglicans were doing some of the best work in patristics. They were the ones who were translating everything into English.
Yeah.
Whereas everything in Rome was like Latin, and it was like fragments and things like that, because a lot of the stuff had fallen out of use because of the rise of like this radical Thomism and medieval scholasticism. So there was this patristic recovery that was happening in Anglicanism. And I feel, so for me, when I look at it, I'm like, that's the Anglicanism that we can do something with. Like, that's the Anglicanism that really can make progress with Rome if it takes itself more seriously. But again, when we're just saying like, oh, there's 3 streams of ecclesiology, you know, there's the evangelical, the charismatic, and the Catholic. It's like, well, no, Catholic means universal, and it means according to the whole. So the Catholic isn't like an ornament on the tree that you decorate. It's the whole tree, right? So like, you're either Catholic or you're not, right? And so that's where I think that Anglicans can do a lot of work about, again, defining that Orthodox Anglicanism and then reckoning with what happened with Cranmer and that prayer book.
So I think at the end of the day, when you look at the pre-Augustinian approach, and then even during the time of the split, if you would, at that time, what Rome was able to do in the Augustinian area is actually bring unity to dysfunctional practices where like some of the churches were practicing Easter based on the Eastern calendar. Some were based
bad haircuts, man. Bad haircuts. They're not tonsuring right, man.
So it took somebody like Gregory to unify the church. It didn't happen overnight either. Think about the split between Rome and England, especially during the Reformation period, because Cranmer went to Germany for a while. He smuggled a wife back, kind of situation. You look at the whole dialogue there. The problem with something new is you don't know what you are. You just know what you're against. And I think at the initial stage of some of the break, because this is the thing that happened. And the debates still go on to this day, like on the sacraments, for example. King Henry VIII held to 7. Just read his book. We have it.
100%.
But next thing you know, now it's like, well, did the 39 articles mean there were 7 and 2 are categorically gospel, or that there's actually just 2 and the other 5 are not? And then there's debates about the 39 articles. Even I hold the 7, right? I have Anglican friends that would just blast me for believing that the other 5 are actual sacraments. So we have not resolved those issues from that time period that you're talking about. There's still a disunity, even what we are supposed to be and where we get our traction for these things. I think the prayer book is in fact, I know that many Catholics appreciate the prayer book.
I still pray it.
Yeah.
it's still my go-to for the daily office. Well, I do the Lancelot Andrews Press version, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Andrews, he was part of the King James translation and all that good stuff. Oh, good times. But you look at, like you said, look what the English church did in the 17th century and 18th century. What they recaptured, what they recovered, what they did for textual criticism, what they did for history.
They did, though, also what they did developing the day. Okay, so here's the thing. One thing that is just that was great about the English church following the Reformation was they actually did succeed at steeping England in Benedictine spirituality.
That's true.
Something that in Rome was very much still confined to the monasteries. And that's why the rosary kind of steps in, for the laity, because they're not going to pray 150 Psalms, so we can pray these 150 beads kind of thing, But that was the great accomplishment of Cranmer. Now add in the printing press, vernacular, right? You put those two things together, and wow, this great thing that emerges is the daily office, and people are praying it in their homes.
Yeah,
like they're literally praying, which Rome considers, by the way, the highest form of prayer outside the Mass is not the Rosary. I will repeat that. It is not the Rosary.
I want to tell some Catholic friends that.
I know, dude. It is the daily office. Like, it explicitly says that. So yeah, the fact that they were able to accomplish that, and this is something that, to bring it back to the more positive spin, I know I went at the history thing a little bit, so I'll soften up a little bit. But like with Pope Benedict XVI, this is actually something that he acknowledged was the great charism of Anglicanism, and it was the daily office, right? The translation and the proliferation of it, but also choral evensong. He mentioned many times that it would bring him to weep. So
wow,
choral evensong, yes, choral evensong was something that he was profoundly impacted by, because again, think about how Rome prays this and chants it. It's plain chant, or it's Gregorian chant, usually by monks, right? But then when you hear the people of God in chorus with, these beautiful like boy choirs and like harmony, and it's just this, wonderful thing. That was one of the things actually, is some of that high liturgical tradition of the Anglican Church that Benedict saw as a way of, hey, is there something here that we can baptize into the Catholic Church through the personal ordinariate, so as to improve the current state of the Roman Rite, which we know is not in the greatest of states with the Novus Ordo. So in his ideology and his mind, he was saying that, well, look, if we allow the traditional Latin Mass, we allow the Novus Ordo, right? And we allow this Anglican form of the Roman Rite to proliferate, there's going to be a lot of cross-fertilization. And what you'll see is sort of a kind of a reordering of the Roman Rite back to this ancient kind of reverence that is more recognizable to the history of the church. So I think that's one of the great gifts of Anglicanism.
I think that's an interesting point too, because when you come into the discussion here, it seems like Pope Benedict was probably one of the better friends, if you would, to England and the Church of England. And there's no doubt the Church of England, if they had to pick their top 5 popes, Gregory and Benedict are in the top probably 3, honestly.
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense with this. And he sought unification. He sought unification with them. But what he tried to do is unify not just on a surface level, which I think Francis is probably doing at this point. But maybe it's deeper, and we don't know. This wasn't supposed to be out, so we don't have the specifics.
Right.
But it seems like he understood that there had to be some sort of, like you said, cross-pollination, some sort of liturgical connection. And, there's multiple things. The Anglican liturgy, when it's done right, is beautiful. Yeah. When you're looking at, and again, you find a lot of the similar things in there. I was watching a Anglican church just the other day down in Florida, and they adapted many of the Latin Mass ideas, but used it in English. But you could tell they took it from the Latin Mass. It's like, wow. Yeah. I didn't know Anglican churches were doing that. It's like, it's like
Cranmer's rolling around in his grave, but yeah.
That's all right. That's all right.
Yeah.
But at the, you're looking at this and you see, but what that tells me is that there's Anglicans that want to have that. They want to have that implemented, not in Latin. I don't know many Anglicans that want to do it in Latin, but at least maybe there are, but like they want the dynamic of it at least, or the elements of the Latin Mass, or even forms of the Latin Mass where Latin comes in, but not the whole thing.
Sure.
I can see that. I like it. I like things about the Latin Mass. I know that you guys just broke a sweat the other day over this thing because it looked like some of the American Catholics were about to have to say goodbye to it. But it looks like that's not going to happen. But
no. But you know what? This actually goes back to the Malta document, because in there, one of the things that was clearly stated was that if you especially look at the bottom of the document, it shows you all the things that we should strive to have liturgically in common with vernacular liturgies. And it's like, we want to have the same translation of the Lord's Prayer. We want to have the same, like, the Lord be with you and with your spirit, right?
With
like
your spirit.
The greetings, right? We want to have the same translation of the Gloria. So there was like this idea that, like, if we start kind of praying the same way, we'll start thinking the same way. And that was what gave rise to the lectionary that Anglicans currently use. Is basically the same lectionary as Rome's. So like we have like the same readings and the same days and stuff. But that also gave rise to the 1979 prayer book, which, for better or for worse, right? Because there was a lot of stuff that kind of crept in at that point. But if you read the Eucharistic canons in there, they are very similar to Rome's Novus Ordo. So there was a concerted effort on both sides to say, let's start praying the same thing. So again, liturgically trying this rapprochement, which ended up, kind of failing, but that was the vision anyway.
Well, and it's not a bad idea. I think that could be picked back up.
Well, I think the beauty of it is that it's being picked back up, but organically instead
organically,
of
it's not being forced from the top down.
Just like you said, like you have these people who are doing the Book of Common Prayer, but they're doing it almost like a Latin Mass, right? You have the Ordinariate Mass, like totally just as part of the Roman Rite now, like praying like Anglicans, but it's like better, like it's not watered down and goofy and like claiming to be ancient, but it's actually not. And it's like just a bunch of scholars like smoking in a room and figuring out a new liturgy for us. It's like, this is all happening very organically. And it's I don't know if you guys see it in Anglicanism. I mean, obviously I see it totally in Catholicism, is this desire in the millennial generation and the younger generation to be completely 100% authentic. And I think, and my brother and I have talked about this in our podcast, where it's like, it follows the foodie movement, the craft beer movement, craft wine, craft coffee. It's like authentic. I want to take something, I want to look at the ingredients and see only a few, because that's what I want to eat, right? I don't want to see a bunch of artificial stuff on there. And I feel like people are doing that in a way too with church. They're looking and say, I want authenticity, right? So if that means like, so even for like a Presbyterian, it's like, I'm going to be a freaking Presbyterian. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to be really, really Presbyterian. And I think Catholics are like that too. And I think Anglicans are starting to be that way as well, especially with the influence of the REC and like Reformed Catholicism and these kinds of things.
I think you're right about that too. And what we're watching happen is, if you're going to follow the prayer book, you're going to be a little bit higher church. I don't care what anybody says. If you're going to do it right, you're going to be higher church. I was actually just talking to a priest the other day. We were sitting down having coffee, and he said that it has been demonstrated that the churches currently in the ACNA that are growing, the church plants that are growing the most, are fully dedicated to following the prayer book as it is written, which will give you a higher practice. And this is something that was important to me. My wife and I, as we have spent more time in the Anglican church, we have desired the higher church practices. We've enjoyed, recently, some Anglican churches that are in the ACNA, not REC. Well, REC is being its own diocese, but I should say my diocese, started implementing incense, for example. I think it's awesome. Yeah. It's fantastic. There's nothing that makes me happier than walking in on a Sunday morning and I'm watching the priest go down the aisle with the incense. It adds a whole new dynamic.
Continuity. It adds a continuity of the cult between the New Testament and the Old Testament. It's like, that this is the same God that we're worshiping. And that's the problem that really crept in. Unfortunately, some of the radical elements of the Reformation, but then even more so in the 20th century, you kind of have this like liturgical Marcionism that creeps in, where it's like, oh yeah, God doesn't really want to be worshipped that way anymore, though, with all the, the stodginess and the bells and the smells and all that stuff. In fact, the incense, we have allergies now. It's like, okay, is this the same God, or is Jesus really a different God? Like, what are you trying to say here with your outward expressions? Because if anyone would have walked into the temple in the Old Testament and then walked into, say, a high church or like a Catholic church, like they would have seen the continuity. Even if all the symbology was different, they would know the ethos was the same and that this is the same God that was being worshipped. But like, that's what happens when you kind of just like scrap it and start your own thing. You're like, well, you literally just replaced the cult, which means in some way you're going to replace, in the minds and hearts of the people, you're going to replace God with something else, like completely. But
I think that these elements are the best thing that's happening. You're right. It's our generation that's demanding it. One of the biggest accomplishments and stuff that we're seeing in the rise of Anglicanism is people leaving low church to become high church. And the ones that are in low church are discontent with low church and they're actually pushing for a higher church. I know I felt that way. So these are important elements that I think we long for the same things. I think Roman Catholics and Anglicans, we want the same things. We're just going to have to figure out, like we've been talking about this whole time, what are we willing to live with or without to make that happen? And the Malta I document mentions these things like papal infallibility, which again, Anglicans are not against. Most Anglicans, I don't want to speak behalf of everybody, but most Anglicans are for the See of Peter and its leadership. They are. I'm fine with the idea of a papacy. It's a few elements of that. The Mariology, like we talked about, or things of that nature. These are things that I wonder. And obviously it's just you and me talking here. I don't know. I'm sure the delegates talking to each other have way better insight on this than we do. But I doubt they forgot that. Like, oh, you guys believe that? Oh, I forgot y'all don't believe that, But another big issue that came up wasn't on the Anglican side. It was actually the Anglicans wanting clarification on the most recent fiducia supplicans, which I had Eric Ybarra on twice now on this very thing. I went on Reasons in Theology, Michael Lofton. I was on there. He and I had a dialogue back to back. In fact, I don't know if you saw, Eric actually put a post out the other day.
I did. I just saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I took the black eye for the team. You're welcome, Catholics. I did what I could to get Michael to admit that Pope Francis fully was aware of something, and I got him to contradict himself by the end of the episode. I took a black eye doing it. Yeah, I took a black eye for everybody. So, show us some love over here in the Anglican corner, because we went in there and did the dirty work. All right. So, but this is a concern that people like Lofton are just radically saying, oh, no, never in a million years kind of situation. Obviously, it was enough for these delegates to bring it up. Yeah. And now what's interesting is Rome's response was that we still hold to that. They gave the same standard answer they gave to everything else. But isn't it interesting that it was actually, what is the magisterium doing here? Because we're a little confused. We're in negotiations about this. And then the Pope sits there and because apparently the negotiations are pretty deep, at least in discussion, maybe not on paper. And then whammo, here comes fiducia supplicans, and the Anglican bishops are going back and saying, okay, we need some clarity here, because, I'm sure up to this point, the Anglicans have to do much of the compromise, but this was a non-negotiable for us because the ACNA, Orthodox ACNA, just split with the Church of England this year over same-sex union blessings. Yeah. So this was like a wrench thrown in the system to a lot of Anglicans. So what's your thoughts on even Rome's response to them? Like, oh, no, that's, we wouldn't do that.
Oof. You're putting me on the spot in public, but so I'll try to be as respectful to the Holy See as possible. So here's what I would say. For Anglicans to understand what's going on, but especially when they're saying, well, wait a minute, like, what about this magisterium? By the way, I will say this. I think Bishop Sutton's a fine man. But I do think in this moment, he was being a little bit cynical and kind of, it was good though. It was a good cynicism. Because, it was the Anglicans telling Rome, like, what's going on with homosexuality, but
that's where we're the redheaded stepchild again. I'm telling you. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Hey, it was a good move though. If I was him, I would have done the same thing. But here's what I'll say. Instead of thinking in terms of like papal office, magisterium, Roman Catholicism, like in this kind of superstructure sort of way, dial it back down and go biblical. So let's talk about the scriptures and say, what would we say about Peter's office if he started to not only do, but also recommend to others a practice which completely undermines the teaching of the church? Would we say, get rid of Peter's office? Or would we say, like, what function is Peter's office really serving right now? No. So therefore, I extrapolate that to an analogy today and say, well, I'm not going to scrap the papal office or question it just because it has recently recommended a discipline that undermines the doctrine. Because discipline is where you can screw up, actually, but doctrine is not where you can screw up. And of course, we know that this did happen. I mean, Peter actually did this. Like, he actually recommended a practice and performed it himself, holding himself aloof from the Gentiles at the Eucharist. Yep. And then recommending that others do the same when supposedly James's men are coming. Well, Paul had to stand up to his face. So I think what we're seeing is actually something. I actually kind of, I was very like scandalized by the whole thing that came out, of course, but I immediately recognized it for what it was. Like, you can even look at like my Facebook posts, like the day of and stuff. I recognized that this is Peter doing his Peter thing again, like being weak in the moment, recommending a practice that undermines the doctrine. And so I said, I hope we hear the voice of St. Paul quickly. And what did we get? We got 24 Episcopal Catholic conferences around the world saying there's no way to implement this without undermining the doctrine. So we won't be able to do it. So that's the side of the papacy that you see when you're in the Catholic Church. I think when from the outside, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, if we were to submit to Rome, we just have to do everything that Rome says. It not necessarily. And there's a lot of times throughout history where this kind of stuff happens.
Sure, of course.
Because again, papal infallibility is not divorced from the infallibility and indefectibility of the church. Not that it depends on it, but that there's a reciprocal relationship between those two things. So again, if the papacy is doing something that is out of sync with the purpose of its office, there's going to be something that rises up to recall it, right? To recall Peter to a practice that confirms his own doctrine. So this is the thing: Pope Francis's doctrine is that homosexuality is a mortal, like homosexual activity is a mortal sin, right? His doctrine is that there's no such thing as homosexual marriage. Like, that can never happen. That's his doctrine. And he said it on multiple occasions.
Yeah,
but then he goes and recommends this practice, which undermines his doctrine, which is what Peter did. Peter had a doctrine coming out of the Council of Jerusalem, but then he did this thing and he recommended other people do it too. And this is what we're going to do when we're around Jews, right? But he's like, but they're like, but then Paul had to say, no, Peter, that's undermining your own infallible doctrine, right? So that's my personal take on it. That's how I see it. So it bothers me, but not to the point where I would question the usefulness of a magisterium. And again, you think of it as like, as compared to what, so you're looking at Rome and you're saying, well, look at all this, all this chaos, whatever. Okay, but as compared to what? What should I take Rome and what's going on with it and compare it to and say, oh, well, yeah, well, then that's better than what's going on in Rome. So and some people may say that. Some people may look and say, well, yeah, what's going on in Anglicans is way better than what's going on in Rome. And then that's why they're Anglican. For me, it was, no, nothing, no alternative is better in my mind. So I'm perfectly satisfied.
Yeah, well, we haven't solved that issue. Like I said, I mean, they voted to actually start blessing and calling them marriages in England. So again, that's why I think everybody like Sutton and Monet were all a little bit thrown off, because we just made a major
100%.
push against our own church on this very issue. And the response was, because Monet's the one that reached out to the DDF, and they stated that and reassured that fiducia supplicans is actually an attempt to curb, not to open up the practice of homosexual behavior. The Roman Catholic Church still prohibits homosexual practice and by canon warns of removal from clergy for such behavior. He added, and the Bishop Sutton elaborated on how Orthodox Anglicans were closer to Rome on the issues of homosexuality than the Archbishop of Canterbury. Of course he did. That was his opportunity to throw an elbow at Welby.
And that's Lofton's position ultimately too. I mean, I know that he's going to take you through a lot of really weird, like, pope-splaining hoops to get you there.
Of course.
But his idea, his prism in seeing it. So I just gave you my prism. That's how I interpret what's going on with fiducia supplicans.
Which I think is balanced, by the way.
Yeah.
I think it's balanced.
I think Lofton's position was more like, well, this was primarily a response to the German bishops who are blessing homosexuals like left and right. Right. And I don't know how much I buy that personally, but
no, not a chance, because the bishops.
But that's the excuse. That's the rabbit that Fernandez is pulling out of the hat there. The head of the DDF, like he's the one. That's what he's relying on. But
the problem with Lofton's position is that he's taking the role that you're taking the position that it's a bad practice, right? Doctrine. He's saying there's no bad practice here either. That's the issue with Lofton. It's like, oh, come on, man. Like, and then obviously there's more development. We even just saw where Pope Francis, I mean, you saw it, Eric posted it, once again, writing his thumbs up to certain priests. I'll
mention them.
Okay. All right. I mean, hey, that's you deal with your people. We'll deal with ours over here. We've got our name calling. But when you look at this whole thing,
Yeah.
These are issues that were important to the Anglican side of things, which is important to Rome too. I'm not saying it's not, but we just got out of a dogfight over this issue. We just lost our Archbishop of the See of Canterbury over this issue and had to call him to repentance for not only a faulty practice, which you guys are struggling to like balance all that out, but you at least have the doctrinal side right. England doesn't.
Right.
They're doctrinally wrong. They've gone apostate on this subject. And so, yeah.
Well, I have great gratitude for any, Protestant or otherwise communities that are out of communion with Rome, but are still also willing to hold Rome's feet to the fire on it. Like, again, to be that kind of a voice of Paul to Peter to say, hey man, like that's not your doctrine. That's not the proper physical manifestation of your doctrine. Like that is immediately going to be confusing to the common layman who's standing there in church watching these two guys get blessed by a priest, and they know that those two are like living together or something. It's like, bro, that's always going to be misinterpreted. But again, because practice is supposed to reflect doctrine, that's the purpose of practice. But there's this weird liberal tendency in Anglicanism and Catholicism to use pastoral practice as a way of like getting away, around the doctrine, right? Instead of expressing it.
And you can't do that. It'll lead you into a contradictory situation, which is what's happening here. But there's two sides of this that call out Rome. Those that just seek to find any kind of fault they can to just trash. Yeah. And then there's those of us who are actually genuinely concerned, because one of the things that we celebrate in this side of Anglicanism about Rome is that they still hold to key elements like that. Like this is canon. This is a non-negotiable. It is that causes us to rejoice because we wish we had that. Yeah. We wish we had something like that to use against. We did. I mean, Welby broke canon law even in Anglicanism to do what he did. But
yeah, 100%.
But we don't have the magisterium. This is where a magisterium would have been better in a circumstance. But again, people apostatize, unfortunately.
Well, this was one of the ironies actually in what Sutton said when he said that, with our conciliar view of the church, we see the failure of a magisterium to maintain the integrity and unity of the faith. Maybe failing to maintain a unity of praxis, but not the integrity and unity of the faith. That was where I was like, because Pope Francis clearly said he's not changing anything with regard to faith or morals, right? Sure. Like that's not happening. And if he did, that would be like, I mean, it would be canonically. I think there's some Roman apologists say he would actually cease to be the Pope at that moment. How many times am I going to do that? So here's the thing, like when Sutton says with our conciliar view of the church, like what you just said, right? Like where you're like, we don't have that. We don't have a way of like making this right when someone goes off the rails, right? That's where I was like, well, then you guys need to figure that out too, right? Like you need to figure out, what do you mean that you're a conciliar church? I say this to the Orthodox all the time too, that like the irony of conciliarism is that it never gathers a council, because it doesn't have primacy. You can't have council without primacy. Like, and that's actually one of the conclusions of some of the ecumenical dialogues between Orthodox Anglicans and Catholics. I don't remember what document it's in now, it was years ago, but they basically said that you can't have conciliarity or synodality without primacy. They sort of mutually inform each other. So what is Anglicanism going to do with this lack of the default head of the Archbishop of Canterbury? They'll even say like, oh, he was never the head. That was always just kind of like an arrangement,
first
like
amongst equals.
Yeah. And it's like, well, okay, well then who's the next first amongst equals? And I'm not even saying that cynically or to be a jerk. I'm saying seriously, because we are going to need to know, on the Roman Catholic side, we're going to need to know, like, where are we taking this dialogue, and how many Anglican groups are we talking about here? Seriously.
It's going to be quite a few.
Yeah. And I will say this too. I want everybody to remember Michael Ramsey in all this, because Michael Ramsey is also, he was instrumental in even starting this in the first place.
Yes, he was.
This Anglican and Catholic dialogue with Pope Paul VI. And one of the things he wrote in the Anglican Spirit was that one of the greatest missions of Anglicanism is to die. Like he himself said that Anglicanism is not supposed to outlive the reunification of the church. So he himself says that the goal of Anglicanism is to be this bridge point between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and until all shall attain to the unity of the faith. And once they do, there's no need for Anglicanism anymore. Like he said that. And so I think in these dialogues too, it would be good for Anglicans to decide what they think about that. Right. Because
I think we should clarify too that doesn't mean we lose our identity.
No.
Yeah. Because I could see the comments already going. Wait,
no.
Can't be
that's
what
not what
we
I'm saying.
are. We can't. No, yeah. Just for clarity, that's not what's being said here.
Yeah. But he's saying like these structures that like, oh, you'd maintain these like separate Anglican structures and this separate like we are Anglicans, we're not Roman. It's like, well, no. If we all come into communion, if that's happening, right? It's just we're just Catholics at that point. Right. Like there is no like, oh, we're Anglicans. Like it would have to be, we're all Catholics. Like, and then if the Eastern Orthodox went, we're all Catholic Orthodox Christians. Right. So that was kind of what he was saying, is that like, we can't hold on to identities that developed out of schisms. And we have to remember that if our goal is to get back to pre-schism, all of the identities that emerged post-schism are going to have to fall by the wayside and be nailed to the cross.
Yeah. And that's one of the things. So, this goes back to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in our creed. Is that's what it is. The only thing that sets us apart, as Anglican, the nice thing about being Anglican is it just means from England. So like the jurisdiction, the location, the term Anglican would be that of identifying location or certain kind of liturgy. Like you said, we talk about liturgical practices. There are some distinctions. There's good, like Anglican could just mean, oh, they use the prayer book over here, or, but I don't think most Anglicans have a problem with that. I don't think the term will ever go away because it sets distinction on some of these things, but we would rather be one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And, we dreamed about this, for years. And, I was actually talking to one of the priests here, Pat May, and I said to him before this was ever released, this was just a few months before, I said, can you imagine a day when the East, the West, and Anglicanism all come back into unity? And at that time, I was like, nah, that ain't never going to happen. And then like this, I think that Anglicanism has a better chance of finding communion with Rome again than the East at this point. I don't know your feelings on that. I know there's discussions on every end here, but to me, there's a closer opportunity, a more realistic opportunity with the Anglican Church to find communion again than even with the East. What is your perspective from some? Because I know there's discussions everywhere. We use the Filioque way, but go ahead.
Very good. So I think in one sense, yes, in one sense, no. And I'll say why.
Okay.
I mean, and I think that's a stupid answer, but I'll do my best.
No.
So,
go ahead.
In one sense, yes, because we're drawing from the same tradition. We're drawing from the Western Christian tradition for our theology. Like when Anglicans talk, I mean, I know that Anglicans in recent years have tried to be like, okay, wait a minute, like we're kind of like the Orthodox now, and they start using Orthodox terms and stuff and putting Orthodox things in their liturgy. But it's like
a little bit, yeah.
No, you're Western Christians. Just dig in.
At the end of the day, we're more Western than Eastern.
Be sure. Anglican. Like when you're talking about justification, like the Orthodox aren't listening anymore. So there's a reason why when we're talking to each other, we're sharing common language. In fact, the only reason we use the words like atonement, that's an English word that doesn't even exist in Latin. It doesn't exist in Greek. So like the word atonement was an Anglican, well, not an Anglican, but I mean like an English Catholic word that even then into the Reformation was continually used. So the concept of atonement is a very Western concept, born in the English language. So there's a great example of like, we're using this shared theological language. This is why the Latin church, one of the pros of using Latin all those years is that like the language was dead. So it didn't change. But when language is evolving and changing over time and you're having theological discussions, you're often wondering, like, are we even saying the same thing anymore? This is what happened with the Monophysite and Miaphysite controversy. That all of a sudden we look back on it, we're like, wait a minute. They literally were saying the same thing, but using two terms and misunderstanding the terms. And so much so that we signed a joint doctrinal statement about it, saying, like, dude, that's totally what happened. Even historians are like, that's what happened. Like, so the Monophysite controversy is kind of put to bed in a way because there was this language barrier, this language difference. So language is very, very important. You have to be very careful about how we use language in theological dialogue. But I'm just saying that the shared common language between Rome and Protestantism in general and Anglicanism in particular makes us able to cross bridges that we can't quite cross yet with the Orthodox, right? However, on the flip side of that, there is such a unity of faith that exists and cult and practice and private devotion between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics that there's a lot less barriers to entry in a way. So what really is a barrier to entrance for Orthodox and Catholics is, again, the fact that these are independent churches. I know we say Orthodox Church, but that really doesn't exist. It's autocephalous Eastern churches, right? And the fact that out of 250 million Orthodox, 150 of them or something are Russian, right? And the Russian Orthodox and the rest of the Byzantines don't see eye to eye.
No, not at all.
So again, if coming into communion, you're like, who am I coming into communion with?
Coptic, Russian, who we going in? Yeah.
Well, and then you have the Oriental churches, and that's a whole other thing, right? Yeah. You know, the ones that stem from the Nestorian controversy or the Chalcedonian controversy.
Oh my goodness.
So you're like, man, I mean, that's a cleanup job. So it seems insurmountable on both sides, but also, you know, there's elements with the East that are way closer to Roman Catholicism than it is with Anglicanism, but the shared theological language and mindset, the Western mindset of Christianity, is totally there with the Anglicans. So it's kind of like where you're going to make progress and in which places and with which communions. But I will say this. So there's one thing I want to make sure I say. I don't know if you ever read this book, but I want to recommend it to your audience. So this is William Forbes, Moderate Considerations. It was originally written in Latin, but he's an Anglican theologian from the mid 19th century. But literally, dude, Bishop Sutton, if you're listening to this, like, you should take this book and literally use it as a template for the dialogue with Rome. Because what William Forbes did was he took basically the major sticking points: justification, purgatory, invocation of the saints, Christ as mediator, the Eucharist, and a few other things, okay, and prayers for the dead and things like that. And basically went through, like, the patristic era. What do the patristics say about this? What do the reformers say about this? What does Rome say about it? And then at the end of it says, okay, we're not with the radical Reformation on this. Like, they went too far.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to be. Yeah.
But we're not with Rome all the way, right? So we say it's this. So what's really great about this volume is that William Forbes was truly crafting a unique Anglican theology of these things. So you get these things like, instead of invocation of the saints, you get, like, I think he called it comprecation. So it's like you pray with, but not to, right? You pray. So there's all these little things that he does in there that I think are actually really fruitful territory. So all Anglicans who are listening, it's out of print, so I had to even get it with Google Books. But if you get this volume, dude, I'm telling you, it's huge. And he spends a lot of time on justification, which I find to be a pretty boring topic. Personally, I'm not really interested in that topic. But all the other stuff that he talks about, though, is like, man, this is really good stuff. And if I was talking to an Anglican about this, it would be a really fruitful conversation. So I actually I would recommend that volume.
Well, that's good. We're always looking for things to read, and there's people like that in our history that most people probably don't know exist.
And it's out of print.
And well, that doesn't help. It doesn't help at all. But even if we can get our hands on key elements, you know, specific statements, major lines, paragraphs, chapters, these things are good. And, you know, I think the discussions are getting better and better, and it's happening even in our territory, podcasting. You know, I've got Trent Horn coming on just in next month. Trent Horn's coming on the program, and what we're going to talk about is the sacraments. And we're actually going to talk about where Anglicans and Catholics agree on sacraments. Well, this Anglican does. And when looking at the idea of how the Protestant, and this is actually what the episode is going to be, the Protestant Reformation did damage to the sacraments. That's the nice thing about Anglicanism, is I don't have to agree with the Protestant Reformation. Right. I have a I have a priest friend here. He's in the other town right down the road. His podcast is called Barely Protestant. He's an
Oh
Anglican
yeah.
priest.
Wait, what's his name?
James, Father James.
Yes,
And I'm not
James
even gonna try
Gadd. Is that his last name?
Gradal. I don't even want to try to pronounce his last name. I just call him Father James.
Okay.
We had lunch together a few months ago. Actually, so he just recently invited me, and this isn't public until today, so congratulations to those that are live stream. I'm going to be speaking at the conference that he's hosting with Calvin Robinson. He's got Matt Kennedy, Bishop Chandler Jones is going to be there on Mighty Men of Valor conference to kind of piggyback off of what Calvin Johnson did in Charleston that got him in trouble a couple of months ago. So he actually asked me to speak on Mighty, and I'm going to be on the Saturday slot, and then I'll be on the panel discussion afterward for Q&A. But it's at his church, St. Francis. So those that are listening to this, and I don't know if Father James is listening, he's usually tapped in on here. But if you're interested in that, follow Father James. There's links. It's here local here in Spartanburg, Greenville. It's in Spartanburg. I'm in Greenville. But I'll be speaking at that with some pretty prestigious Anglicans. I'm pretty pumped about that. In fact, I'm scheduled to pick up Father Robinson from the airport, so it'll be great.
Oh, that's great, man. Congrats. That's cool.
Yeah. Yep. It's good stuff. Well, I don't want to take any more time because we're getting to the end of our time here. Actually, we went over most podcasts, but this is too good not to cover.
This is fun, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, love it. Love having conversations. This went about the way, I mean, I've always enjoyed your stuff, and we're both pretty similar in that we're blunt. We hold to what we hold to, but I think we're nice enough. Somebody said you were a jerk. I didn't get that. So I don't know. I
think I'm just a jerk in print. I get that. Cause I kind of just I just say what I think, but in person, no.
Well,
I'm a
social media.
I'm a good time,
then. Well, let's make this not the last time. There's plenty of other things we can talk about too. So
yeah, for sure. And honestly, if anybody also, since we have such kind of a similar audience, if anybody is interested in the first 500 years of Christianity on our channel, the Catholic Brothers too, that they'd probably find interest. We have a first 500 years series where we go through the first 5 centuries of Christianity, and it's in a very again friendly format. It's not like, hey, you should be Catholic today or something. It's very, and it's actually very much informed by historiography and not so much by theology. So yeah, welcome anybody to go to the Catholic Brothers and check out our first 500 year series. But yeah, thanks a lot for having me on, man. This was great.
Absolutely. And the link to their channel is in the actual description. So make sure, if you have not yet liked or subscribed to their channel, highly recommend them. I enjoy listening to them. I have other friends and priests and podcasters that listen to them as well. That channel needs to grow as well. And they put out really good content. So go in there, find these series that they're doing. It's real good. Your brother is a very intelligent guy as well. In addition to, you two together are a tremendous team.
Thank you, man.
So I know my co-host listens to you guys as well. So this is great. All right. Well, thanks for jumping on, man. I'm going to put you backstage and then I'll finalize over here. All right, folks. Thanks again for tuning into this episode. Hopefully you learned something. I did, because that's why we're here, is to learn. But there's a lot of things that need to be discussed further. And I agree with Stephen on that. We have to have discussions in the Anglican side of things that go in more depth than what we have. We got to have these conversations. But this is a really neat opportunity. This is a big deal. This is historical. That has to be acknowledged. This is something that we haven't seen in hundreds of years. And if the Lord opens this door, I think it'll be for the better of his kingdom and his church, to bring it back to one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. If you're new to this channel, this is your first time tuning into Facts. We do anything under the acronym Facts: Fathers, Apocrypha, Canon, Text, Scripture. We talk about multiple things. We have multiple episodes of myself just individually, or with my co-host Tyler, who's on sabbatical right now, or I have guests on like Stephen here. So thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time, if you would like and subscribe as well to this channel, you can also hit that bell right there to give you notifications when new live streams come out or pre-recorded. We'd love to have you continue to follow us. And for those that are regulars and those that are listening on the podcast side, not on the YouTube side, thanks again for tuning into this episode. Grace and peace to you. God bless.